Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome. I'm Ross, and I'm live from the Athenaeum in Jackson, Louisiana, home of HOREB Institute for the historical and objective research and exploration of the Bible, and home of United Israel World Union Center South. Thank you very much for joining me today for my class, The Sabbath, the rest of the story. Now, this is an exciting class. I'm looking forward to teaching it. I'm glad that you're here with me today. We are presently working through the Pentateuch, following the annual cycle of readings. We are in a series within the series, Perspectives in the Pentateuch. But this section that we're dealing with, the book of Exodus, we are leaving Egypt. So we're in the book of Exodus in the Torah portion, Vayachel, which begins, if you have the Exodus Torah tablet, on page 214. It covers Exodus 35:1 all the way through chapter 38, verse 20. Now, one of the things that I thought about as I began to think about what to talk about today was that it felt a lot like deja vu. Whenever you get into Torah portion Vayachel, in fact, when you hit chapter 35 of Exodus, chapter 35 through the end of the book, it feels like there's a lot of material that you just read. And that's true, because what we really have is Vayachel covers much of what we just came across in Torah portion Truma and Tetzaveh, because Truma and Tetzaveh deal with the instructions of what is to be made. In other words, it describes all of the items, all of the sacred precinct that is going to make up what is called the Mishkan or the Mikdash, and we just read all that. And then once you get to Vayachel, you're dealing with the actual making. So you have the instructions of what is to be made, followed by the execution, which is chapter 35 through 39. So rather than get into the material that we've already covered, I think fairly well, I decided to think about what would be a good class that would fit into this material, and it hit me. There's one subject that connects both the instructions of what is to be made and the execution of what is being made, and that is a singular topic that occurs in both of these that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the Sabbath. Because if you look at those passages, those Torah portions which deal with the instructions of what is to be made, it ends with a portion on the Sabbath, a pericope, a saying, a set of instructions that deals specifically with the Sabbath. And then if you look at the execution, which begins in this particular Torah portion, it begins with the Sabbath. So we're going to start with that. We're going to read this morning chapter 31, verses 12 through 17. 31, verses 12 through 17. We're going to begin there. It's on page 192 in the Exodus tablet. Page 192, Exodus 31, beginning in verse 12. And Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily, ye shall keep my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye, plural, may know that I am Jehovah who sanctifieth you. Ye shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. Every one that profaneth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to Jehovah. Whosoever doeth any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days Jehovah made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and he was refreshed. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that particular section, but this particular section of text, Exodus 31, 12 through 17, is associating not only the Sabbath with the tabernacle work, but the Sabbath with creation. We're going to unpack this as we work in today's material. Now look at chapter 35, verses 2 through 3, which is on page 214 of the Torah tablet. And we're going to open up. This is the opening part of Vayakhel, the Torah portion we're in today. In fact, I'll go ahead and start in verse 1. Moses assembled all the congregation of the children of Israel and said unto them, These are the words that Jehovah has commanded, that ye should do them. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be to you a holy day, a Sabbath of solemn rest to Jehovah. Whosoever doeth any work therein shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire throughout your habitation upon the Sabbath day. So, both of these texts dealing with the creation of a sacred, holy space on earth, particularly the tabernacle and all the accoutrements, all the furniture and so forth, both of these texts highlight the importance and the significance of Shabbat. Now, whenever we get into the subject of Shabbat, it is a vast topic, as you all know, broad and varied in the Bible. As a noun, the word Shabbat appears 111 times in the Hebrew Bible. Now, 47 of those, nearly half, occur in the Pentateuch. Exodus has 15, Leviticus has 25, the book of Numbers has only 4 mentions of Shabbat, and Deuteronomy has 3. There are 32 occurrences of the noun. Now, we're talking about the noun at this time, Shabbat, in the prophetic text. Amos has 1, Hosea has 1, Isaiah has 8, Jeremiah has 7, and Ezekiel has 15. The bulk of those are in 2 chapters in Ezekiel, by the way. And then when you get to what we would call in the academic world, the historical books, you have 30 occurrences, some odd. You have Nehemiah has 14, Chronicles 10, and 2 Kings chapter 6. Now, I'm not going to go through all of those, and the crowd said amen. But I'm going to go through a substantial number of texts. There will be some repetition in this because some of the text I'm going to read a couple of different times to pull out different important aspects that I'm trying to cover in this particular class. But I promise you that no matter how long you've been studying, no matter how much you cherish and value the Sabbath, I'm hopeful and prayerful that you're going to see some things that maybe you didn't notice before. Now, what I want to do is I want to begin to narrow my focus and narrow the scope of what I want to share with you today, because like I said, there are a lot of different directions we could go on a class dealing with Shabbat, because not only when I talk about 111 occurrences, they don't all deal with the weekly Shabbat. Some deal with at times the Shabbat is used to describe one of the annual festivals or a specific sacred day within the festival. Sometimes Shabbat is used with the Sabbath year, and sometimes we see Shabbat as the Sabbath of the land. Now, my focus today is going to be on the weekly Sabbath, all right? And for the sake of time and scope, I'm personally, during the class, not inclined to enter into any sectarian debates, either old or new. So I'm not going to get into some of the debates about Shabbat. What time? What time does Shabbat start? Is Shabbat from daylight to dark? Is Shabbat from sundown to sundown? We're not going to talk about the lunar Sabbath. We're not going to talk about any of those ideas in this class. However, in the after class, some of that may or may not come up. We'll see. Additionally, I'm not going to get too much into non-canonical works. I'm not going to delve into the New Testament text, and I'm not particularly interested in, nor am I going to get into in this class, rabbinic literature. Again, I'm going to focus on the Bible, and particularly, I'm going to put quite a bit of focus on one thing, and that is the Decalogue. I'm going to focus on the Decalogue because it's at the Decalogue. We have two accounts. We have one in Exodus chapter 20. We have one in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And we're going to pull those together side by side, and we're going to look at them because both of these texts, Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5, in both of these texts, they claim to be the word from heaven, from God, speaking from the midst of the fire on the day of assembly, as the book of Deuteronomy puts it, to an assembled group of people. So both of these texts claim to be, this is the word of God, and this is supposed to be one of the words, one of the 10 words, Aseret HaDevarim, that makes it onto the stone tablet, but they're different. And we're going to talk about the differences right now. If you look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 through 11, and you look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15, side by side, we call this horizontal reading, you begin to notice some similarities and some differences. Now, this, by the way, is also available on a sheet that is on my academia page, the link to which is in the description of this video. We're going to start with Exodus 20, but we're going to look at both of these side by side. Exodus 20, verse 8 through 11, remember the Sabbath day to separate it. By the way, this is my translation of the Masoretic text Hebrew. So if you're asking what translation is this is my personal translation. 6 days you shall serve, and you shall do all your work. And the seventh day is for Jehovah your God. You shall not do any work, you and your son and your daughter and your servant and your handmaid and your beast and your stranger who is in your gates. Verse 11, because, in other words, this is the reason you're to do all this about the seventh-day Sabbath. Because in 6 days Jehovah made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day and separated it. Now that I've read Exodus, as you look at these two side by side, the text that is in black is that which is corresponding to the other text. Remember, both of these texts, in the context of Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, claim to be, this is what God spoke. But they read differently. The red, some of you are used to red letter being something else. The red ought to throw up a flag. The red is different, okay? Now look at Deuteronomy 5, while Exodus is before you as well. Deuteronomy 5, guard the Sabbath day to separate it, as which Jehovah your God commanded you. 6 days you shall serve, and you shall do all your work. And the seventh day is for Jehovah your God. You shall not do any work, you and your son and your daughter and your servant and your handmaid and your ox and your donkey and all of your beasts and your stranger who is in your gates, in order that your servant and your handmaid may rest as you And you shall remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and Jehovah your God brought you out from there with a strong hand and a stretched out arm. Therefore, Jehovah your God commanded you to do the Sabbath day. Now, we're going to leave these up. We want you to think about this as we work through. I'm going to talk about some of the similarities and differences which are before you, because these are very important. I want to know, I hope you want to know, I want to know which one of these more accurately reflects that which was written on the stone tablet, right? And what are we to do? Are we to guard, or are we to remember? They're two different words in English. They're two different words in the Hebrew. Now, what a lot of people do, fundamentalists and apologists, they don't worry about these differences. They think that it's not a big deal. In fact, some go so far as to say that when God spoke the word, he spoke both of these. All right. Now, that is an extreme apologetic trying to cover the fact that we have differences. Okay. I'm more interested in truth. I'm more interested in getting back to what was actually spoken from HOREB. Now, you might think, how would you ever be able to tell? We'll see. We'll see if my method works. We're going to cover this. Now, let me talk about this for just a minute. When these words were spoken from HOREB, and we're not going to get into right now, by the way, the order, like which commandment is this, because it depends. If you're Jewish, most Orthodox would number it a certain way. Protestants, Lutherans, Catholics, because they didn't come with Roman numerals in the text, so people have to guess. Because technically, if you count the words that are spoken, they don't come up to 10. They don't come up to 10 in the Masoretic text, and therefore Christians, Jews, various religious groups who look to these texts to try to discern what was spoken at HOREB are left to fend for themselves. They either have to split the first commandment, the first word, into two, or they have to take the covet command or word and split it into two to make 10. But we have answers for all of this. Stick with us. Okay, so if you look at the differences, Exodus has remember, Deuteronomy has guard. Notice that focus on the red. If you look at Deuteronomy, you see red at the very top because it says, as which Jehovah your God commanded you. This clearly was not etched in stone. For one, the writer, the person who wrote it according to the text, is God. This is a third person insertion. In other words, someone, could be Moses, someone in the writing of Deuteronomy chapter 5 is telling us that there was a command to separate the Sabbath day, and it was commanded by God, right? And then it picks up, and all the black is the same between Exodus and Deuteronomy. Notice that Deuteronomy adds ox and your donkey and all of your, see, it has beast. So if you look back at Exodus, it just says your servant, your handmaid, and your beast and your stranger. Notice Exodus, your son, your daughter, your servant, your handmaid, and between your and beast, it has ox, donkey, and all your beast. Okay. And then it has an interesting insertion here, in order that your servant and your handmaid may rest as you. So this one, the focus is going to be in Deuteronomy on creating rest. It's going to be, you will rest, therefore they will rest, or you will cease, as the case might be, and then rest will come to others. All right, now the major difference between Exodus and Deuteronomy, other than one says remember and one says guard, the main difference is the reason for the Exodus. The reason for the Sabbath. If you follow Exodus, you're going to see that it has to do with a 7-day cycle. You're going to remember that because in 6 days, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, and he rested on the 7th day. Now, that's the way Exodus puts it. You're resting on the 7th day, and it makes sense. It flows logically with the command. You work 6 days, you rest on the 7th. Why is that? Oh, God worked 6 days and rested on the 7th. See, it flows perfectly. Deuteronomy doesn't have that connection. For Deuteronomy, for the writer of Deuteronomy 5, you are to remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and Jehovah your God brought you out from there with a strong hand and stretched out arm. Therefore, Jehovah commanded you to do the Sabbath. Now, again, some may think that it's unsolvable, that we can't determine which one of these is original and which one represents a later interpolated interpretation of the original words spoken at HOREB. One other point on the Exodus version while you're looking at them is notice that the way Exodus 20 ends is that therefore Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day and separated it. Now, I should let you know that when I say separate, in the Hebrew, I'm looking at the root word kadosh, which means some translations will say sanctify or to make holy. And I'm okay with either one of those, but it clearly means to make it separate, make it distinct. And that's what we're talking about today. Okay, so from the outset, you've seen that there are considerable differences between the two accounts of the 10 words, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Again, if you want to look at this and study it more deeply, look in the link. You'll see you'll see a link in the description below for a document that contains my translation of Exodus 20 side by side with Deuteronomy 5, and you can compare those. Both versions charge the people to sanctify it, i.e., the 20th, sanctify the 7th day, and that's Exodus 20, verse 8 and 10, and Deuteronomy 5, verse 12, and verse 14. The Exodus version adds additionally, God blessed and sanctified or set apart. So if I set aside the fundamentalist and apologist view that both of the reasons for Shabbat, namely the creation, the 7-day cycle of creation in Exodus, and Deuteronomy's idea of redemption, representing the original word of the Decalogue, if I can set that aside, is it possible to get back through a careful, critical study of various texts within the Pentateuch and maybe the Dead Sea Scrolls as well? Can we get back to which one came first? Can we then determine what was etched in stone according to the biblical writers? How would we possibly do that? How would we decide which of the readings is the more original? All right. Let me talk for a minute about Deuteronomy and the idea of redemption, because we're going to see some of these ideas. One may think, and I've heard this, and I think I probably have taught this in my past, one may say that, well, the reason that there's a focus in the Decalogue of Deuteronomy on the of rest, no rest, because as a slave, as a servant, the children of Israel weren't able to rest. And we see in Deuteronomy sort of an extra push, a reason for the Sabbath is so that others may rest. So you could make that connection. You could say, well, that might be a good reason. And so here's what we do. We see some of these things in other texts other than Deuteronomy 5. I'm trying to figure out the best way to word this. Okay, so in order that your servant and your handmaid may rest as you do, is also found in other texts of the Hebrew Bible. Look with me at Exodus 23:12, and that will be in the Torah tablet on page 134. Exodus 23:12 says, 6 days you shall do your work, and on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your ass may have rest, and the son of your handmaid and the sojourner may be refreshed. You see? So this idea, in order that your servant and your handmaid may rest, that we see in Deuteronomy, is reflected in other texts in the Hebrew Bible. So it's not like this idea is without merit or without support from other texts, primarily priestly texts. But there's also the idea in Deuteronomy, again, dealing with the association of the Shabbat command with redemption. We also see a repetition of a reminder, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. We see this in Deuteronomy 5:15, in Deuteronomy 15:15, Deuteronomy 16:12, and Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 18 and verse 22. But get this, none of these associations with redemption, Deuteronomy has an association of Shabbat with redemption, but none of these have anything to do with 7 days or with a 7-day cycle of work and rest. Both Exodus and Deuteronomy mention 6 days for all your work, but the seventh is for God, no work. So both of these texts, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, both have 6 days work, 7 day is for God, no work. So there's a 7-day cycle that Deuteronomy leaves unanswered that Exodus has an answer for. Now let's look at the idea of rest, though, in several texts in Exodus. Let's start with Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11. Now remember, I told you some of this we're going to have some repetition, but it's because I'm going to draw out different aspects from the text. So this is going to be on page 118 of the Torah tablet, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11. For in 6 days Jehovah made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now, where it says hallowed in the ASV, which is the text we use in the Torah tablets, that's where I would say separated it. But either way, to hallow, to separate, to sanctify, the idea is basically the same, to set it apart. That's what it means. But the word that I want to highlight here is the idea of rest. Now, in this particular passage, we see that God made heaven and earth, the sea, and everything that's in it, and then God rested. According to this text, the verb is, the root word is nun chet. Nun chet. Now, some of you will know this Hebrew root word. It's the same word that is the root of the name Noach. Noach means comfort and rest. So this idea is that God is taking a break, is the way it's described, right? Now, the next text I want to look at, we're going to focus in on various Exodus texts that, at least two of them. We're going to look at Exodus chapter 23 and verse 12, which is on page 134 of the Torah tablet. Exodus 23 and verse 12. 6 days you shall do your work, and on the seventh day you shall rest, that thine ox and thine ass may have rest, and that the son of thy handmaid and the sojourner may be refreshed. So I want to bring up a point here. Here again, this is, on the seventh you shall rest. Same verb. The root word nun chet. You shall rest on the seventh day. God worked 6 days, rested on the seventh. You're going to work 6 days. You're going to rest on the seventh. But notice there's a reason for your resting. See, a lot of people just say, thank God Almighty, I made it to Shabbat and now I can rest. Well, the whole purpose of you resting, according to the priestly writers, is that it allows others to rest. Your beast don't have to work because you're not working. The handmaid doesn't have to work because you're not ordering her around. You don't need anything done today. Relax, chill out, take a break, rest, be refreshed. This is the idea. It is not just for us to rest, but that the rest may be passed on throughout the society. It's a day of rest. Everyone is supposed to be entitled to rest. And one of the beautiful points of this priestly idea is that it extends not just to humans in all classes, but it extends to the animal world as well. You're not going to tie your beast up and have them tread the corn while you're taking a break, you see. Now, in Deuteronomy, this particular idea shows up in chapter 5 and verse 14. Look with me, Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 14. Again, according to the ASV, let me start in 13. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath unto Jehovah thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thine ox, nor thine ass, nor any of thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. Now here's the reason. That thy manservant and thy maidservant may rest as well as you. You see, all of those named are named for the very reason that the rest that is given to you by not working on the seventh day is then passed on to everyone else in society. So a lot of times, when people say, should you spend money on Shabbat? We're going to get into a lot of this in the after-class discussion. The idea is that you aren't going to do that kind of thing because it causes other people to work. Now, if other people cause other people to work, that's bad enough, but you don't be part of it. This is the idea behind the command, you're going to rest so that others rest. So again, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, Exodus 23, verse 12, and Deuteronomy 5 and verse 14, all of which deal with Shabbat, the verb nun het, to rest, comes out very clearly. So this is the idea in support of, at least in some ways, I could see someone maybe proposing that Deuteronomy chapter 5 reflects an original idea concerning the Shabbat. But now I want to shift the focus to the Sabbath and creation. The Sabbath and creation. Now, if the Sabbath and creation are connected together, we ought to look at those verses as well, and that's what we're going to do. So I want you to look with me at Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. If you have the Torah tablet, it's on page 8. Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because that in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Now, this particular passage has quite a few connections with what we read in Exodus 20. It also ties in other ways with Exodus chapter 23 and other Sabbath passages that we're going to see. You'll notice on the screen that we have Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. We just read that, so I'm not going to read that one, but these are connected to the 7-day cycle. In other words, you work 6 days, you rest on the seventh, and there is that connection between creation and Sabbath rest as we see in the 10 words. But I do want to look at Exodus 31, verses 15 through 17. That's going to be on page 192 of the Torah tablet. 192 says the following, Exodus chapter 31, beginning in verse 15. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to Jehovah. Whosoever doeth any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. Why? Glad you asked. For in 6 days Jehovah made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So again, we have the reason here in Exodus 31 for Shabbat being tied to the creation. Genesis chapter 2 has the creation. Genesis chapter 20, verses 8 through 11 say that the reason for the Sabbath, you work 6 days, you stop on the seventh, because God worked 6 days, stopped on the seventh. You see, there is a clear, concise correlation between your action and your lack of work on the seventh day with God's action and lack of work on the seventh day. So it says very interestingly that God ceased Shabbat. The word Shabbat, a lot of people associate Shabbat with rest, and that's okay if you're tying the word to an idea of rest, because we saw that in some of the passages I just read. But Shabbat does not mean rest. It means stop. It means cease. And so you cease, and thereby you rest and are refreshed, because we and our animals and our servants, people who work for us, people say, I don't have any servants. Well, I don't either. But people who work with me, if I have a business or something, that's the idea, is that everyone around you, the ripple effect of you resting brings rest and refreshment to those around you. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls also have quite a bit about Shabbat. I'm not going to read all of what the Dead Sea Scrolls have when it comes to Shabbat, because some of it is, quite honestly, a bit crazy, I guess you would say. But we're going to talk about some of that in the after-class discussion. But I do want to look at a couple of passages from what is called the Book of Jubilees, right? The Book of Jubilees is a manuscript that was found among the documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls. By the way, if you really want to study the Dead Sea Scrolls, I have quite a few links in the description below, but I highly, highly recommend the 2-volume set, the Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition by Martinez and Tichelar. And this is, again, the link is below. This is volume 1, and I want to read the Jubilees from 4Q 216. And if you have this book, and some of you may, it's a good book, go to page 461, and we're going to look at a couple of passages about Shabbat, mainly to see in this ancient body of literature, what did they associate Shabbat with? The redemption or with the creation? So here's an example. This is from column 5, and it's going to begin. I'm going to begin in line 1 of column 5, the Book of Jubilees. Jubilees 2 is what this is called, like chapter 2 of the Book of Jubilees. And the angel of the presence told Moses at God's command, write all these words of the creation, how on the 6th day, Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, God finished all his works and all that he had created and rested on the 7th day. and made it holy for all the centuries and placed it as a sign for all his works. And then it goes into other texts. Now, this text, by the way, is not totally preserved. Some of this has been supplied. Anytime you're studying ancient manuscripts and you find brackets, this is a scholarly feature that lets you know that that which is in brackets has been resupplied for, and it's usually done with some good science behind it. Either because we have another copy of the same manuscript and we're able to match what is still present in the text, or something of that nature. And this text is, it does have some gaps, but it's been resupplied as followed. Now, or repopulated where it was missing. So now I'm going to look at the next page. We're still in Jubilees, and in this particular text, this is in column 7 of Jubilees, 4Q 216, says, "And he gave us a huge sign, the day of the Sabbath, on which he rested from doing all the work which he had created over the 6 days. They were made in 6 days, and we observed the Sabbath on the 7th day, refraining from all work. For we, all the angels of the presence and all the angels of holiness, these two kinds, he commanded us to observe the Sabbath with him in the heavens and on earth." Interesting, right? Now, again, this is sectarian. I'm not talking about this is, necessarily true or inspired. You can take that how you wish, but this is from an ancient document, and it reflects the worldview and understanding of Shabbat in a very ancient text. Now, the other thing that we want to do is we're going to move beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we're going to talk about some of these ideas that show up regardless of which text we're looking at as it pertains to Shabbat. Ceasing. Again, the word Shabbat means to cease, to rest, refreshment are often associated with the 7th day. But here's something that I think is at least worth bringing up, and that is that few people who study the Sabbath, who observe the Sabbath, I find that they are less inclined to talk about the other half of the command, right? A lot of people go, 7th day, I'm going to stop. 7th day is a time to stop. But that's only part, and that's a smaller part of a 7-day cycle. What do we do on the other 6 days, boys and girls? Few people highlight that the rest of it is, you shall work for 6 days. Now, some might say I'm being a little bit picky because you might be able to read it. You're going to do your work in 6 days. In other words, you have 6 days to get it done. So if you can do it in 3, then take off, 4. I'm not sure I follow that, but I get it. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go through a couple of texts which deal with the idea that you have to pay attention to the work 6 days part. Now, we're going to cover some that I've already gone through, but we're also going to look at Leviticus chapter 23, verse 3, and Deuteronomy 5, 13, and 14. So let me go through quickly. You're going to say, well, we just went through these. But it's all right. You got time. Page 118 in the Torah tablet. I'm going to start with the Exodus text. This is chapter 20 of Exodus, verses 9 and 10. Here we go. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath unto Jehovah thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor the stranger that is within thy gates. And then it gets into the reason, and the reason is the creation is a 7-day cycle. Again, chapter 23, verse 12, you ought to memorize these by the end. I don't even want to apologize for going over them because I think these are essential. 23:12, 6 days. 6 days shalt thou do any work, do thy work, and on the 7th day thou shalt rest. that your ox, your ass, may have rest, and your son of your handmaid and the sojourner may be refreshed. Exodus 31:15, page 192. I want you to see, work 6 days, take a day off. 192 is going to be Exodus 31:15. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to Jehovah, right? Exodus 34, verse 21. This is on page 210, and it says the following. 34, verse 21. 6 days shall you do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. 35, verse 2 on page 214. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be to you a holy day, a Sabbath of solemn rest to Jehovah. So it's pretty clear. Now let's look at Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 3. Oh, wait a minute. I almost forgot. I have a Leviticus Torah tablet now. Leviticus 23 and verse 3 is on page 146. 146 of the Leviticus Torah tablet. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no manner of work. It is a Sabbath unto Jehovah in all your dwellings. By the way, we're going to talk a little bit about this in the after class discussion. The chapter 23, a lot of people look at this as a very special text, and it is. It deals with the festivals, according to the priestly writer, the festivals of the Lord, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Now, the interesting thing is that the chief of which, a lot of people talk about other days being more special, but the Sabbath is mentioned first. And I think that that is quite important. One other text is Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 13. Deuteronomy 5 and 13 says, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath unto Jehovah thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, etc. Again, over and over, and I think most people know that this is the cycle. 6 days you work, and on the seventh you rest. You cease. You don't do any work. And thereby other people are rested, other people are refreshed, and your beasts are also refreshed, and they also get to rest. All told, the Sabbath appears as a noun 111 times in 89 verses. But get this, it never appears. The Sabbath never appears in Joshua. The Sabbath never appears in Judges. The Sabbath never appears in 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel or 1 Kings. What? I find that striking. And I have some ideas, but I'm not going to do it here. But it should make us pause. Why is it that nothing is mentioned, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, or 1 Kings? Now, I'm going to give you a part of this. What I really believe is most likely the reason that it's not mentioned is, drum roll, it wasn't kept. Certainly not widespread among the people. The prophets, when the prophets speak about Shabbat, they're normally critical of the manner in which it was observed or not observed, probably better stated. And it's also that when the prophets mentioned it, they contrast the common practices of observance or lack thereof with the desired behavior, what is supposed to be being done in terms of keeping the Shabbat. So we're going to go through a couple of prophetic texts. We're going to start in Hosea and Amos, because Hosea and Amos are from the northern kingdom. These are some of our earliest prophetic texts, the prophetic text in Hosea and Amos. So let's look first of all at Hosea chapter 2 and verse 13. I think it's verse 11. Yeah, verse 11 in English, verse 13 in the Hebrew. It says, I will also cause all her mirth to cease, her feast, her new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all her solemn assemblies. So what this tells me is that at least in this text, in the north, they were observing these festival times, including Shabbat, probably not rightly. They probably weren't doing them correctly. They probably weren't doing them with sincerity, and we see that in other texts. So let's look now at Amos chapter 8, also Amos chapter 8, verse 5, associated with the north, saying, verse 5, when will the new moon be gone, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great, and dealing falsely with balances of deceit. Now, this indicates that there is an observance, but it's like, I got to keep the Sabbath. How long is this Sabbath going to take so that I can get out and mess over people, and rip them off? I mean, that's like, I'm going to keep it. I'm going to keep it because I need to keep the Sabbath. I'm not going to work on the Sabbath. I'm not going to sell. But man, when I see 3 stars twinkling, I'm going to hit the road, you see. This is the idea that we see here. Now look at Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 13. Isaiah 1:13. Just going to read this part of this very critical passage. Bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies. I cannot. Away with iniquity and the solemn meeting. And it goes on to talk about how Jehovah hates their assemblies, which is something we could get into. Now, we're not going to get into at this point, but I encourage you on your own to read such text as Jeremiah chapter 17, which is very much a condemnation of the way that the people are behaving, in particular, how they are observing or not observing the Shabbat. Also, I would recommend, though we're not going to read, Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 22. I'm sorry, Ezekiel chapter 20 and chapter 22, which also deal with the profaning of the Sabbath. So these texts are very much an important part of the study, but slightly outside the scope of our class today. But I also want to point out that there are prophetic texts which see the right observance of Shabbat as beneficial, not just for Jews, not just for Israel, but for all of humanity. So I want to read a few texts, if you will. Go with me to Isaiah chapter 56, verses 2 through 7. I'm going to give you 3 texts in Isaiah 56, verse 2 through 7. Here we go. And it says, blessed is the man, Ashrei Enosh Ya'aseh Zot. Blessed is the man that does this, not the Jew, not the Israelite, and the Son of Man that holds it fast, that keeps the Sabbath. In fact, in Hebrew, it's guard, that guards the Sabbath from profaning it and keeps his hand from doing any evil. Neither let the foreigner that has joined himself to Jehovah speak, saying, Jehovah will surely separate me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I'm a dry tree. For thus saith Jehovah of the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths, and choose the things that please me, and hold fast my covenant. Unto them all those just listed. Will I give in my house and within my walls a memorial and a name better than of sons and of daughters. Read that again. Better than of sons and of daughters. I'll give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Also, the foreigners that join themselves to Jehovah to minister unto him and to love the name of Jehovah, to be his servants, everyone that keeps the Sabbath from profaning it and holds fast my covenant, even them, get ready for an interpolation, we'll explain, even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. By the way, this that I read in a different voice is another hand. Here's the way it's said before it was interpolated. Everyone that keeps the Sabbath from profaning it and holding fast my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. Reads perfectly. But someone said, wait a minute, got to put some sacrifice in there. So the idea of Isaiah 56 is that Shabbat has implications for all of humanity. Now let's look at Isaiah 58, and beginning in verse 13. If you turn away, im tashiv, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy of Jehovah honorable, and shall honor it, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in Jehovah, and I will make thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and I will feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of Jehovah hath spoken it. So the idea here, obviously, is if you focus your Sabbath on your Sabbath to making it holy and set apart and dedicate it to Jehovah and not pursuing your own things, look what's going to happen. Good things come as a result. Now look at Isaiah 66, and at the very end, verse 23. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith Jehovah. From one Sabbath to another. This idea of Shabbat going on into what is called typically in Judaism and many people who lean towards a Hebraic understanding in their eschatology, this Olam Haba, the world to come. This idea is that Shabbat is going to be a time of refreshing and worship on into eternity, if you will. So quite an interesting passage. Now, the earliest version of the Decalogue Sabbath word gave the reason for observance to be the 7-day creation cycle. I'm proposing to you that the earliest strata of the Shabbat command was originally tied to the 7-day creation cycle. And this is supported by other priestly text and extra canonical works found at Qumran. But Exodus 20 is not the original. And we have various proofs for this. Again, it's very important to note, and don't get nervous because we're going to spell this out, but Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 both claim to be the word spoken by God to an assembled group of Israelites from the mountain, from the midst of the fire, on the day of assembly, per the writer of Deuteronomy's words. But these words don't agree. So we know that one of them can't be the actual words that were spoken. And this is not so easy that people can just say, well, yeah, Ross, Exodus 20 is the original. Deuteronomy 5 is just reworking, and it's been a while, and Moses just kind of doesn't quite remember, whatever. People come up with all sorts of reasons. But the various proofs as to why this is not, Exodus 20 is not the original words that God spoke from the mountain, from the midst of the fire on the day of assembly. And you'll have to go with me again to Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8. Exodus 20 and verse 8. Let's read that one more time. Exodus 20 and beginning in verse 8. Here we go. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath unto, third person, Jehovah thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor the cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days Jehovah, third person, made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore Jehovah blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. These are words that were supposed to be spoken by God. So you would expect them to be in the first person. Interestingly enough, many sages and scholars and rabbis noticed this when they would study Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5, because both seem to know this at the beginning, because they begin in the first person. I am the Lord your God, right? So that's first person. But then something happens in each of these versions, Exodus and Deuteronomy, which don't agree with each other. Something happens and they switch to the third, as if another writer is filling in what is missing in an original text. So we're going to talk about quickly, but we're going to go through an idea of what that original would have looked like. So here you go. Everybody get ready. I'm going to give you what I believe is what that original would sound like in English. Sanctify the seventh day. In 6 days I made the heavens and the earth and all that is in them, and I ceased on the seventh day. Therefore, you should cease also, you and your animal and all that is yours. Anochi Elohim Elohecha. I am Elohim, your Elohim. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the way that this command, this word, reads in the Moses scroll. In the Moses scroll, if you have the Moses scroll, on page 164, I have the text of the Moses scroll in the book that tells the story of the scroll. Most of you know this who follow my classes. But I'm going to read the Sabbath command from this Dead Sea Scroll that is fascinating beyond any other scroll. I have all the scrolls. There's not another Dead Sea Scroll. There's not another document. The Samaritan Pentateuch doesn't do it. The oldest Paleo scrolls found at Qumran don't do this. The Septuagint doesn't do this. And what does it not do that this text does? This text, written in Paleo on leather, says in the first person, get this, sanctify the seventh day. In 6 days I made the heavens and the earth and all that is in them, and I ceased on the seventh day. Therefore you shall cease also, you, your animal, and all that is yours. I am Elohim, your Elohim. And by the way, on page 185, another unique feature of this text is that it ties that not only in Deuteronomy, it says we're going to get a ceremony of the blessings and the curses, and the blessings are missing. Only the curses are given. And people have noticed this and don't know what to do with it. This document not only has 10 words, and they're easy to count because they all are signed off by God, but each command has a corresponding blessing and a corresponding curse. So with the command, the Shabbat command, here in the 10 words, the blessing says, "Blessed is the man who sanctifies the seventh day and ceases thereon." What's the curse? Cursed is the man who does work on the seventh day to profane it. So there you have it. The Sabbath is a 7-day cycle of work and ceasing, of work and rest. Work 6 days and rest on the seventh. The only reason that's given is the biblical creation narrative. The only reason that ties a 7-day cycle, work 6, take a seventh off, is a creation, and that is the original, and you heard as close to the original as you will ever hear. And that, ladies and gentlemen, now you know the rest of the story. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Join me for the after-class discussion. If you're part of the Yachad, meet me in the Zoom. If you're not yet part of the Yachad, our support team, you'll be redirected to a YouTube video to watch the first little bit of that. And if you need the link, for some reason you're not redirected, it's in the description as well. Thank you very much.